Hello, and welcome to Totally Got Out of Bed, a project and podcast by two non experts sharing our stories in the hope that you feel less alone as you struggle to live in the wake of a loss to suicide. Whatever brings you to this podcast, welcome to the club. We're sorry you're here. I'm Nora Flum, and I lost my son Eric to suicide on January 3rd, 2018. He was 25.
And I'm Tony Plant. I lost my 15-year-old daughter Anna on January 30th of 2016. We're getting close now to the ending our series on getting through that first year. So before we start today, I'd like to ask for your help. We're almost through the first year. Our first episode's about grief, getting further through the first year. As we head into this next phase of the project, we'd welcome any ideas you have as to what you'd like to discuss next. We'll most likely focus on some facts, bring in some guests, and discuss societal issues and stigma. And we'd love getting your emails and would love to hear from you with your ideas as well. So email us at totallygotoutofbed@gmail.com. So for this episode today, we're focusing on the physical aspects of grief. During the first year especially, what are the physical consequences of grief?
I think I talked a little while about the exhaustion that I didn't even know was there until it came back. Um, as I look back and as I remember not feeling like I could accomplish anything. I had reduced stamina. I could not continue with any task. I couldn't concentrate on anything for very long. I could hardly finish anything I started. And I think I also had a reduced immune system because um, shortly, well, I was out of the country when Eric died. And so I took a plane trip, and I think I must have picked up a bug on that plane trip because I immediately got sick. I ended up with bronchitis, and I think maybe even had pneumonia, but I remember coughing constantly. So getting through that first week and a half, 2 weeks before I got onto antibiotics was a nightmare. And then I remember I recovered for a little while, and then I ended up back in the emergency room, the urgency care center. Interestingly enough, both times I ended up in urgent care, it was in Chicago. The first time we were there to gather the first of the things that we needed to see the space, to see if we could find a will, to see if we could find anything out. But that was just a quick trip, and we were back within a few days. And then the next time we spent a little bit longer to clean out his apartment, to pack everything up. But yeah, both times I was sick and could not function. And I do remember journaling about not being able to grieve well because I couldn't cry without coughing. So I felt like I was all stopped up. I couldn't let anything go. I could not let anything be cleansed. I was just kind of folded in myself and could not emerge. So that was the first thing about grief that I can remember was feeling sick, just physically sick.
Mm. hmm Yeah, they say that lowered immunity in people experiencing grief is very common. And, it has to do with just so much stress on your system, of course, because when you're grieving the loss of somebody to suicide, it can be the most stressful thing imaginable. And all that stress on your system is what leads to the lowered immune system. And I think, obviously we talked about this in other episodes, but it's like you just need to do your best to take care of yourself, but it's not necessarily even going to matter at that point, but you have to do your best because otherwise, if you get sick, it's like Nora was saying, it's just going to add to the stress and likely make things worse. So I think it's important that if you're in that stage when you start feeling like, you're getting sick, that you just take extra care and see if there's any way you can get through it because, it sucks bad enough. We don't need any added stress on top of that.
Yeah, and don't feel like it's all in your head either.
Right.
It's for real, a real thing. So listen, do what you got to do. You got to go to the doctor, go to the doctor. You got to take antibiotics, take antibiotics. Yeah, we try not to give advice, but I guess take care of yourself is a pretty safe bit of advice, right?
Right. Right. Good point.
Um, so besides the depressed immune system, I also remember my mind seemed like it was half a step or a full step behind what was going on around it. Like I wasn't reacting in real time. I remember feeling like a decreased reaction to almost any stimulus, but at the same time, a hyper response to any trigger. My husband said at one point that he said, everything annoys me, but nothing bothers me. And I think that was a good way to put it because there are lots of little things that people talk about, people griped about, people commented about that I would react in my head, what the fuck does that matter? You know? And then I remember one thing that you said once, Tony, is that when people would get stressed out and people would have these hair on fire drills, you would be like, what's the matter? Nobody died.
Right.
And I remember feeling like that could put things into perspective for me. So, just that idea of get over yourself. It's not that big a deal. Nobody died. So all that little stuff annoyed me, but nothing really bothered me because at the same token, nothing that were to happen now could be anywhere near comparable to the worst thing that happened to me. So, yeah, it is what it is.
That's right. Yeah. I remember that too. I remember feeling like that was the reason it was, well, one of the many, but one of the reasons it was so hard to go back to work. It's like, seriously, you think I should be caring about all this stuff? Because I just don't. You think somebody calling me complaining about your customer service matters? Did your kid die? I mean, that's sort of how my mind would go. And I agree with you. It's like nothing mattered, but don't say the wrong thing to me because that mattered. So, yeah, it was
Exactly, exactly.
sadly a dichotomy.
Anything could trigger me. A song, a look, an innocuous comment, even the sight of people smiling and having a good time could be a trigger. So there's no way that I could control the outside world and how that reacted and how that lived its life out. But still, again, I was like half a step behind or a step behind because everything took a minute to register and everything was filtered through this death that I was still suffering from. I could not experience anything without processing it through the lens of my grief.
Right. So true. The encompassing grief. This I just had this thought in my mind. There was a show that came out just shortly after Anna died, maybe a year or two. I think it was called A Million Little Pieces, maybe. It was about a suicide. I don't know if anybody's watched this, and that might not be the name of it because, brain fog, no idea. Anyway, it was about someone who died by suicide and sort of everybody's reaction. Of course, I wanted to watch it because I wanted to be able to, kind of know what to tell people. Yes, that seemed realistic, or no, it didn't. And I remember thinking when they first talked about the suicide, people weren't crying. I'm like, okay, so there was like one person with one tear, maybe two tears. I'm like, now wait, this is just so not right because that encompassing grief is just everywhere. I mean, people, we just sobbed, especially right at the beginning. And these were people like waiting in the waiting room. And they just sort of sat there and a tear would come down their face. Who does that? It was all physically encompassing to me anyway. And so to me, that was not realistic. I remember thinking, what? How can that even be? That's just not real. So anyway, that's sort of an aside that just came into my mind right this minute about the physical.
Yeah, I do remember that you talked about that at Grief Group, and I remember not wanting to watch the show in the first place and
Right,
wondering why people would want to watch it at all,
right.
but knowing that I couldn't handle it, but also remembering, yeah, you're right, I can't function, I can't talk without crying, I can't see without crying, especially at first. So, yeah, and the only thing I can imagine is maybe there's no way an actor can portray that without having been through something like this. And so maybe the director, taking a minimal approach, decided that that was the only way it could be portrayed because nobody is capable of portraying the reality.
Yeah, maybe that could be because that was my entire thought. It's like they're just not sad enough. Sorry. They just don't get it. Yeah. Um but in researching this a little because I wanted to know like what people out there kind of thought, not just me, and I found it like fascinating that specific heart problems actually can be caused or brought on by grief. and that it's really not just due to the greater stressors in the lives that of us that are grieving. And one study actually found that there is a correlation between the death of a loved one and an increased possibility of a heart attack. And so there's actually a syndrome named broken heart syndrome that's brought on by the death of a loved one. The syndrome is caused by a disruption in the blood being pumped to one section of the heart. It actually mimics a heart attack by causing chest pain and shortness of breath. What I read said it should go away on its own, but of course, if you experience this, it's important to see a doctor. But that shortness of breath was a real thing for me. I remember it, and I never thought it would be that. I didn't even know about this broken heart syndrome, but it probably was that. When I look back, when your whole body aches, though, that's kind of how I felt, and you never sleep, and you're exhausted, you just assume that the shortness of breath is from that. So anyway, I thought that was a fascinating little tidbit that you can actually have this disease or this syndrome called broken heart syndrome.
Yeah, I don't think I had that, but I did have something that was different. I remember at one point several, probably 6 months, 4 to 5 months anyway, starting to feel a real tightness on the left side of my
Mm.
neck, shoulder, down my side. And that continued to get worse over time. And I'd been under the care of a doctor for a while for back pain that was a result of a car accident that I'd had in 2015. I'd had back pain for a couple of years until I found this doctor who, within a month of seeing him, I started feeling better. Shout out to Dr. Forres at the Pain and Brain Healing Center in Blaine. Yeah, he had me on the road to recovery within a month after having started seeing him, after having been in pain for 2 years. So I'd been seeing him every month or so for maintenance. He is a neurologist, but also a chiropractor, acupuncturist, acupressurist, and whole medicine, functional medicine doctor. And so I talked to him about this numbness, tingling, and he did some testing, did some research, and it got so bad that I at one point felt like the whole left side of my face went numb from my forehead down to my chin. And I did all kinds of regular tests. Went to see my other doctor, got an MRI, got two MRIs actually that did investigations, and nothing. They couldn't find anything that was wrong. But Dr. Forrest did some research, and he said, yeah, this kind of symptom can be associated with trauma. And he said, so this is a traumatic response that your body is going through. Now that it's a couple years later, I can still feel tightness in that area sometime, but I don't have that numbness anymore. But yeah, it's a real thing, and I didn't realize that an external trauma could have such physical symptoms in the body.
That's truly amazing. I don't think that I've heard that story, nor that's. I'm glad you got through it. It's very scary to think what could have happened, and I guess we don't really know, but it's a good thing you had that doctor. Shout
Yeah.
out to him is right. That's great. Good deal that he knew what to think and was. It sounds like holistic enough that he took that approach to the whole body. So and the whole everything that happened in your life and such. So that's great.
Side note, too, when I did go to the regular doctor, found out that my blood pressure was higher than normal, if my cholesterol was higher than it used to be. And so I don't know if that's a symptom of just getting older, because I am over 50, so that could tend to happen. But I've also heard that after trauma, people's bodies tend to start to deteriorate faster. So higher blood pressure could certainly be a reaction to trauma as well.
Yeah, I think it actually, they say it can be. I feel the same way, Nora. Both my cholesterol and my blood pressure are higher now. And I think, well, is that just because I'm older or is that because of all the stress? I mean, who knows, I guess. And we'll probably never know, but it is interesting because they say it certainly can add to it. I remember one of the things for me too, besides the numbness and tingling, I just had more, I didn't have that actually go to the doctor thing, but my whole body at first, it felt like that anyway. And just my whole body was like numb, felt like a zombie almost walking around, and I didn't feel anything. And I also remember in those first few days, I just couldn't eat at all. Nothing. It was the furthest thing from my mind. Nothing sounded good. Nothing was good. Most food made me want to throw up. me, just the thought of it. It was that, I suppose it was that pit in your stomach, that you get when something so horrible happens. But I was just frozen and numb. I just walked around like a zombie, like I said. It was during those times that it was always so good, like we've discussed before, to have people bringing you food, because otherwise you wouldn't eat, you know. And I just remember also feeling totally exhausted, but yet I was restless and unable to sleep. So it was really hard to fall asleep, and then I would fall asleep, and then I would wake up. So it was just too much. My whole body ached. And, I read when I was doing that research as well, that it can be at least partially contributed to your body's reaction to an increase in cortisol, which is that fight or flight thing that happens when we're in that sort of a traumatic situation. Even going through any kind of trauma, and a suicide loss would certainly fall into that bucket of trauma.
Absolutely. You talked about the fight or flight reaction. I do think that there's a third option. I think I've mentioned this before, that rather than fight or flight, another reaction to stress is building community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that I consciously was working on building community with others, but people rallied around me. People came to me, and I think one of the wisest things I did was I realized that I wasn't going to do this on my own, and I try to be pretty independent. I try always to do things myself and do things for myself, but I think part of me realized at that point that I couldn't, and just letting people do things for me was the smartest thing I may have done at that time. I think I mentioned before that we had meals brought to us, or people volunteered to bring meals for us, and that lasted for months. And I think the old me would have said, no, I can take care of this, I can do it. But this broken me said, do whatever you want because I can't do anything else. So, community rallying around is important. But the underside of having community is that when you are around people, people are not always smart and people are not always sensitive. And so people can do things unintentionally that are very, very triggering. And I remember probably the most drastic example of this for me was I was in a conversation with a number of people, and one of the people in this conversation talked about the stressors that were going on in their life. And they kept going on and on and on and building and building and building. And this litany of stressors ended with, and I just want to throw myself off a bridge somewhere. And the room got quiet, and I stopped. And I held my hand out, and I said, because that is not unlike how Eric died. And I remember saying, as a mother of a son, and I couldn't finish it. And I said, don't say it unless you mean it. And she said, I do mean it. And I honestly, honest to goodness, I do not remember anything else for a period of time after that. Somehow I made it from where I was to, I had a hair appointment, and I was sitting in my stylist's chair, and that's when it came back to me. That's when I started coming to myself, and I started shaking, and I started breathing hard, and I took a break, and I called my counselor friend, and then I called another friend, and I just processed what had happened. I think psychologists call that dissociation, where
Mm-hmm.
you completely black out and have no memory. And that's real too. And that's probably something I maybe should have seen a doctor or a therapist about, but I didn't, and it hasn't happened since. But I did follow up with somebody else who was able to talk to that person about any kind of suicide ideation that she had. And thankfully, this person said no, somebody else in that conversation had already talked to her, and so she was already aware the conversation had already happened, because, what triggered me was traumatic for me. But you never know what was really going on in this person's heart, and I, in this fog, did not react as a person who had just heard a sincere suicide threat. I reacted as a person who was a victim of a suicide loss.
Right.
So I think that's another huge point, is as much as we want to be isolated and we want to kind of turn in on ourselves, having companions that can be kind of a reality check is not a dumb thing to do. seeking out those people that you can trust that will walk with you and act as your eyes and ears and reality normalizer, maybe, is has been good for me. Not that I, in retrospect, tried to control that or thought that way at the time, but it has always been the people around me that have helped me get through the worst of what I have had to get through.
Right, I totally agree. That is like so two really important things there, Nora, that dissociation thing. You know, if that happens to you or someone you know, that's not abnormal. I mean, it's not normal in normal life that all of a sudden you feel like you're outside of yourself and don't know what's going on. But it is, in fact, in trauma, I think a relatively common thing based on what I've read anyway. So don't ignore it and don't feel like you're absolutely going crazy either. And then the other thing about your statement is just how just like insanely much our society talks about suicide in that sort of derogatory way. I find myself sometimes even just thinking to myself, oh, just want to shoot yourself, or, I just want to jump off a bridge, or I want to hang myself, and you don't mean it. I mean, I don't mean it when I say it, but it's gotten to be a big kind of a part of our society that people think that's okay to say that. And that is really not okay. But two things there. If you hear it and you're a suicide loss survivor, do your best to correct them. But, I realize that they're most likely not doing it to make you feel bad, because it's just, I mean, we've been doing it for how many years? I've probably been saying that for 40 years. So, and it's very
Right.
difficult, to kind of break bad habits, but it's something definitely to keep in mind.
Yeah. I work with teenagers. I'm a high school teacher, and I remember the year after Eric died, working with some freshmen on a retreat, and we were doing something, and one kid did something or said something like, "Oh, I'm just gonna kill myself," and typical teenage statement. Often it is happening without anybody paying attention to it. But I stopped him and I said, "Do you mean that?" He's like, "Why?" And I said, "You have to realize that it's a very strong statement, and I'm the mom of a son who did take his own life, so I need to ask." He's like, "No, I'm okay." A year later, I got an email from a student who witnessed that, and she talked about her own struggles and her own hospitalizations, and she just wanted to say, "It's taken me a long time to write, but I want to say thank you for standing up to it, and thank you for realizing that it's real." And I thought, oh my God, we are unfortunate and unwilling witnesses to this plague, this trauma that is going on in our society. And hopefully, our experience, as traumatic and as terrible as it is, can be used to shed light into the dark corners of what's going on around us, because I swear that this darkness cannot be overcome without the light of somebody else shining into it. And so if all we can do in the midst of this trauma is shine a light into those dark corners, maybe, maybe it can be used to help somebody else.
Very true, very well put. I feel like just if all you do in the world is listen for when people say things like that, like I just want to kill myself, I just want to die, whatever they're saying, and you question them like you did, Nora, do you really mean that? And just take it a little bit further, that's a huge thing. If that's all you get out of any, kind of education around suicide prevention, that's enough, because that's a big deal. Most people just assume that people are kidding, and it's not something you can assume. You need to take it further and know that if that's true and they feel that way, that you care enough to ask. So that's just like suicide prevention 101. The other thing I want to, and I know we've talked about this before, is I want to just touch a little bit more on the physical changes in your brain. And the first thing that I remember is I couldn't remember anything. I mean, I totally was out of it. The things that seemed really important to me went in one ear and out the other. We've talked about this brain fog before, and I could try to write things down, but inevitably for me it just wasn't enough. I do think I remember a little more now than I did at first, but it's still not like pre-Anna dying life. It's still just really pretty bad. And anything that goes or another thing that goes right along with is just that inability to focus. That might even be worse. I cannot focus on anything, and I've always sort of been that way, but I've never been diagnosed with ADHD or anything, so I don't believe I have that. I could, I don't know, but I just have basically an inability, I guess, to focus on just about anything, to get through anything. I struggle through to that to this day. And I think sometimes my mind wanders off to Anna and things that happened or things that won't ever happen. But sometimes it's just because I'll be sitting there and realize I just zoned out for 10 minutes. And it's just, from what I read, it's just your brain trying to get used to your new reality. So it's like this, I don't know, in my mind, this is what I came up with. There's just too much shit in your head. You know what I mean? You got to get your brain around it, but you can't because everything else keeps on swirling inside there. But if you do have this happening to you, just remember that it will probably get better with time. If it doesn't, therapy will help too. But above all else, just give yourself some slack. This is a really big damn deal. And you have a new reality and a new life now. And it's going to take some time.
And nobody can tell you how to feel or what process you should be using. And nobody has the right to tell you that it's time to get over it. And I don't know what the best response is. Do you have a response if somebody says it's time to just get over it? Tony, do you have
Oh
a
my
response
God.
for
Well, the
that?
first thing I would think is, did your kid die? That's what I would think. You tell me that next time your kid dies by suicide, okay? Or simply that, you know what? Oh, I will never get over this. That's probably what I would say.
Yeah.
I don't think people expect, well, you know what? I'm a little bit mouthy, in case you didn't know. So I'm not sure people would ever say that to me. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they would. Nobody has yet. How about that? So,
I haven't heard it either.
yeah, that's a terrible thing. I don't say that to people.
Yeah.
I don't think that's good.
I haven't heard it either, and I don't know how I would react, but I think it would just bring back the brokenness that my world is no longer the reality of most people, and my world is separate and apart. And if you can step into my reality and accept me where I am, then God bless you. But if you can't, please don't, at least don't tell me that what I'm doing is wrong, because there's no way that it can be right. Our world is broken. My world is shattered. If I am getting out of bed, I am winning. If I am able to accomplish anything, I'm a superstar.
It's the truth.
But if I'm not, if I'm broken and you tell me to get over it, well, you know, thanks but no thanks. Go enjoy your world with somebody else and leave me with people that at least can empathize with this shattered, broken world that I live in now.
Yep, very true. Yep, I don't know. For me, I don't really need people in my life that are going to try to tell me to get over it. I'm not trying to be mean, I just don't.
And if you need our voices instead of your own to tell them, to give them that message, send them to this podcast. Tell them to email us for what other possible things they might be able to say instead. We'd be more than happy to give that kind of advice.
Definitely, definitely.
And with that, I think it's time to bring this episode to a close. Remember that if you or someone you know is in immediate danger of suicide, please call 911 or call 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK, or text hello to 741-741. You need to get help, and those are places that you can get help. Or do a search in your area for a mobile crisis response team. Those are teams that are not law enforcement specifically, but are trained more in helping people with mental health issues get some help. For more information about this podcast and this project, visit us at totallygotoutofbed.com. That's one word. You can find other episodes there or wherever you can get your podcasts. We'd like to hear from you. Remember that we are working on what happens after this first year series is done. And we'd love your ideas. So please email us at totallygotoutofbed@gmail.com or visit us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter.
And as always, we'd like to thank our talented team, Wendy Wolf, the tech genius behind our podcasts, Monica Lavorsi, composer and performer behind our theme song, Hold My Hand Now, and a special thanks to Survivor Resources, the group that continues to support us and others in the wake of our tragedies. Thanks for listening today. Please join us on our next episode when we'll wrap up this series on the first year. In this last episode, we'll talk about what did we forget. We'll talk about some of the things from the first year that either we forgot to talk about or that didn't fit into the theme of any episode we've done so far. In the meantime, smile when you can and cry when you have to, and do totally try to get out of bed.
Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now and be as one. The colors start to fade. Gray is the only shade that you see now. Lost in the charade of the journeyman's parade, can't see a way out. As you keep marching onward, oh, all you gotta do is reach out and hold my hand now. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand now and be as one. Hold my hand now. Hold my hand. The tracks begin to sway. You're in the middle of the fray, so hold on tight now. Your grip begins to slip. You tumble towards the lip of the open train, and how? But before the world swallows you up, reach out, there's a place to